Welcome to Missional Ekklesiology. My name is Misheck. I love the Lord and I love God's people. I love the church. In the book of Acts, the Bible describes the church as the body that God died for. And so, in a way, all of us who are called by God, we are called to love the church and to serve the church on top of loving Jesus. Indeed, in fact, we love Jesus by loving his church because we are his body. So today I want us to do an introduction to Missional Ekklesiology. I want to say a few things about why that title, why this kind of a forum. I want to maybe spend some time explaining what I mean by missional and what I mean by Ekklesiology. I'm a teacher by profession. I teach the Bible and theology in a Bible school, but I am also a pastor. And so I combine those two things in my ministry. I do pastoral ministry, I lead a church, I am an elder in a church, and I also teach Bible and theology in a Bible college, in fact, several of them. And one of the things that I have come to love and to find myself so much interested in is this thing called church. This thing called church. Whenever I read the Bible, whenever I read the New Testament, especially its vision of what the church is and why the church is there, it's something that interests me constantly. And so today I want us to introduce ourselves to this topic, a topic that we will be talking about. In fact, in all our discussions, in all our conversations about what missional ecclesiology is all about. So I want to begin by reading a few verses from the Bible, from the Gospel of Matthew. One of the first instances that Jesus himself, the founder of this thing we call the church, speaks specifically about the church. Matthew chapter 16, verse 13. And I will read up to verse 20. Then I will make a few comments as a way of introducing ourselves to this wonderful topic about the church. So it says there, "Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?' And they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' He said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Simon Peter answered, 'You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God.' And Jesus answered him, 'Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven.' Verse 18 says, 'And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven.' Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. This is very much one of the first instances whereby we find Jesus himself talking about the church. The Greek word there is the one Ekklesia, and it comes after him asking the disciples, "Who do people say he is?" And then he moves much closer to, "Who do you say I am?" And then Peter, and of course Peter is a representation of the rest of the disciples, he answers and he says that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus calls that a revelation. He calls that a revelation. And it's a revelation from the Father, from God himself, the Father. But then the interesting thing is what he tells Peter after that. He tells Peter, you are Peter, and on this rock, and I want to believe the rock basically there is the revelation that Peter has come up with, that Jesus is the Messiah. Although there's a play of the words Peter and rock in the Greek, I still believe that the rock has got to do with the revelation that Peter has gotten from the Father of who Jesus is. But what is interesting is Jesus says that Peter, he says you are Peter, or you are Petra, or Petros, and on this rock, Petra, I will build my church. So Jesus is saying to Peter, on this rock, and as I have said, the rock there representing the revelation that Christ is the Messiah, on that rock, Christ is building the church. So this, as I've said, this is the first time we find the word Ekklesia, which in the Greek, in our English versions is translated church. The first time we find Jesus himself talking about the church, and in fact making a commitment, making a promise that he will build his church, and he will build it to such an extent that the authorities of Hades, the gates of hell, the gates of Hades shall not be able to prevail against it. So here is the founder of the church. Here is the founder. In fact, here he calls it my Ekklesia, my church. Here is the founder of the church speaking himself, and he is saying, I will build my church. And of course, it's not difficult for us to realize that when Jesus says that he will build his church, he is not saying that he will erect a building of stone and mortar and build what has come to be called the church today. In fact, in the New Testament, the word church, the Greek word Ekklesia, is never used as a reference for a building where God's people come and gather once in a while. It's never used that way. But the word Ekklesia, or the church, is constantly a reference to God's people, to people who have come to put their trust in Jesus Christ. Or if we talk about, or if we use the language of the early church, maybe we can talk about the composition of the Jesus movement. And by Jesus movement, I mean the first followers of Jesus. Right from the days of Jesus before his death and resurrection, and thereafter, when during the days of Pentecost, when the church is born, when the Jesus movement is born, when there is a new community forming in the face of the earth, And that community is described as the disciples of Jesus, the followers of Jesus, people who have come to put their trust in Jesus, members of the Jesus movement there in its very early stages before Christianity, because Christianity is another thing altogether. Christianity is a more formalized, institutionalized Jesus movement. But it's in the beginning, we don't have Christianity. In the beginning, we have believers, people who trust in Jesus, and they form a community, and they begin to behave the way Jesus behaved, to proclaim the gospel and to live their lives patterned after the life of Jesus Christ. And so back to this text here. So Jesus says, "You are Peter, and upon this rock," that revelation that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, he is gonna build his church. And so Jesus promises or commits himself or gets into a covenant with himself, maybe with God the Father, that he will build a people. He's not building a building. Jesus is not a carpenter anymore. He's not a mason. He is busy building, but what he is building is a living organism. It's a living thing, and that thing is called the church. I think we can quickly check some other scriptures to support what I am saying. For example, when we read 1 Peter chapter 2, it says, it talks about Jesus as the stone that the builders rejected. That is in verse 7. And then this stone has become the very head of the corner, or what we call the cornerstone. And then verse 8 says, he the stone, or he is that kind of a stone that makes them stable. And them there is a reference to Israel. And he is also referred to as a rock that makes them fall. So when I talk about the rock in Matthew, that's my reference there, that Jesus is this rock. So when he says, "Upon this rock I will build my church," Peter is talking about a rock, again a reference to Jesus, that makes Israel, and in this case it's Israel that doesn't believe, a rock that makes Israel fall. And then he says they stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. And again, if we go to Paul in Romans chapter 10, we will find a similar language. But verse 9 is my interest there. Verse 9 says, "But you are a chosen race." Now describing the church, describing this Jesus movement, describing the community of the people that belong to Jesus or who have come to trust in Jesus. Peter says they are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and then he calls them God's own people, and they have a purpose, and the purpose is in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Okay. But before this, Peter has already said something interesting. In verse 4, he says, "Come to him," or coming to him. He says, "Coming to him, a living stone." Again, this language is a language that describes Jesus. He's described as a stone, but not a dead stone. He's a living stone. And then he says, "For rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight." And then, like living stones. So here we have a living stone, a reference to Christ or to Jesus Christ. And then we have another reference, living stones. And that's a reference to people who have come to trust in the Messiah, who have come to put their faith in Jesus Christ. Here they are called living stones. And then Peter says, let yourself, or allow yourselves to be built into a spiritual house. Okay? Let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So here again, we have Jesus described as who is described in Matthew as a rock, but Peter describes him here as a living stone. And then the believers, those who belong to the community of God's people, as living stones, and then they are being built into a spiritual house. So when in Matthew Jesus says, you are Peter, and upon this rock, the rock of Revelation, I will build my church, Peter explains that in his letter here, and he is saying that Jesus is that rock, Jesus is that stone, that living stone, and the believers are living stones, and they are being built to become a house. So when Jesus says, I will build my church, basically what he's saying is that he's going to build his people, and his people will become a spiritual habitation, a spiritual house for him, for God, a holy priesthood, so that they may be able to offer sacrifices that are acceptable to God in Jesus Christ. So again, back to my word, back to my point that Jesus is busy building his church, his Ekklesia, his Ekklesia. He is not building an institution. He's not building an organization as such. He's not building a building. I think many times church leaders call people to help build church. And what they mean by that is, gather money, gather funds, and elect a building, a facility where God's people can come and meet. That is, completely different from what Jesus is doing. Jesus is not building that building. Jesus is busy building the lives of the people so that people can become a house from where he can live, and not only live, but from where he can also work from. A place of service. Okay, so when we talk about missional Ekklesiology, what do we mean by that? What we mean by that, and this will come about, will come clear as we continue to process these things together. What we are talking about is an Ekklesiology, and you can see that word comes from the Greek word Ekklesia, and the Greek word Ekklesia basically means church. And so Ekklesiology is basically a word about the church. It's basically the science of church. Okay? But then now we are using the word missional. So when we combine the two words, missional Ekklesiology, what we are trying to do is we are trying to, figure out what the purpose of the church is by looking again into the New Testament scriptures. We believe that God is not a confused God. He is a God of order. He is a God of clarity. There is no darkness in him. And so the idea of church is an idea of God. Okay? And so what that means is he instituted it, or he came about with it, or he is the one who founded the idea. It is his own idea. And because it is an idea of God, it has a purpose. Okay? So the church has a mission in the earth. Okay? the church as a mission, the church as a work in the earth. And this is not something new. When God created the first man, he placed him in the Garden of Eden and he gave him work to do. He gave him a mission. He gave him a mission. He gave him work to accomplish. When God chose Abraham and his seed, Israel, and then for many years they found themselves in Egypt as slaves, God sent Moses to go and bring out the children of Israel from Egypt. And then in Mount Sinai, he forms them a family. He forms a family. He forms a community. He forms them a nation. He makes them a nation, and he gives them laws by which to live by. But also right there, he declares his purpose, why he has called them. In Exodus chapter 19, he talks about them being precious to himself, a kingly and a priestly people. So he calls them for a purpose. In fact, when God is sending Moses to Pharaoh, he says, "Go and tell Pharaoh to let my children, my sons, let my children go, to let my son go, so that he may serve me." So Abraham is called, and he is called in the purpose of God. Israel is called and is called in the purpose of God. When Jesus Christ comes into the earth, when he is born, he comes with a purpose. And that is the third phase. That's the third phase in what we call progressive revelation. So we find Adam, we find Israel, and then we find Jesus, and then we find the church. And so when Jesus comes about, he does not just come. It's not, God is not like, oops, my son is now in the earth. What should I do? Let's create a purpose for him. No. In fact, when you read Ephesians, the coming of Jesus Christ into the earth was something that God crafted, formed, thought about, planted, purposed it even before the coming of Adam into the earth. And so when Christ Jesus comes into the earth, he comes in the purpose of God. He comes because God has a mission for him. Okay? And so we can in fact talk about missional Christology. In other words, Jesus comes about with a mission. His purpose, his person and his work are completely wired about, crafted and worked out by God the Father himself. The result of Jesus Christ's coming into the earth, the result of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is the birth of the church, And Jesus himself talks about that quite a number of times in the Gospels. For example, he says he must die so that as a seed he may multiply. He says the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. That many there, that is a reference to his movement. That's a reference to the church. And so Jesus comes with a vision, with a mission, and that mission is to live, die, be raised from the dead, and through that, the church is born. And so when the church is born, the church is not just born, but it is born with a purpose, for a mission. And so when we talk about missional ecclesiology, what we are talking about is, once again, rediscovering the mission of the Ekklesia, the mission of the Ekklesia, the mission of the church. it's once again getting back into a conversation by which we begin to ask ourselves in this age and day whether the church is living its purpose or its dreams and visions and aspirations have been diverted, and now we are serving another purpose other than the purpose we were created for. When we are talking about missional Ekklesiology, we are trying to bring about a conversation, and I think this conversation needs to happen all over the place, especially here in Africa. This conversation is already happening in other places, for example, in the West. So I am not really the first person to bring about these two words together, missional Ekklesiology. There are people who have been thinking about this for quite a while now, close to 20 years. But here in Africa, I think we have lagged behind, and we need to bring this conversation into the table and begin to ask ourselves whether we are still serving the purpose we were created for, or we have found ourselves embracing an alternative, or alternatives that are not really what God intended right from the beginning. And so the church is born with a mission. And that's what we are trying to rethink once again, to bring about on the table, so that people can begin talking again about why the church, what the church, what is its purpose, what should be its aims and its goals. Why do we have it in the first place? Did Jesus Christ live, die, and then he was raised from the dead so that we can live here in this world as happy people, healthy, wealthy, according to the now very famous gospel all around us, the gospel of prosperity? Is that really the reason why Jesus came and he died and he was raised from the dead? What is the real reason? What is the real reason? And why does the church exist? And I think many times we listen to the world. We are not listening to the New Testament, so that the New Testament can help us begin to think about these things seriously. We listen to the world, we listen to the systems around us, we listen to the culture around us, we listen to our traditions more than we listen to the New Testament. And so many times the church has found itself as a captive of culture. Instead of the church being a catalyst, being a place whereby the worldly systems find their end, or the worldly systems are transformed and become systems of our God and of our Lord, the church many times has found itself captive to the gods of the age, to contemporary culture, to the gods that rule and govern worldly systems. Many times the church has found itself captive to the ideologies of the world, other than the church providing an alternative, a godly alternative, what God is saying, his voice to the world, to the nations. Other than that, we find ourselves many times following after after the ways of the world, after the systems of the world, after what the world feels is the real thing, is the in thing. We find ourselves running after those very same ways. And that way we lose the mission. And that way we lose the focus. And that way we are not obedient to Christ as he would want us be. And so if Jesus Christ is building his church, his Ekklesia, then it is imperative upon believers, upon those faithfuls, upon the Jesus community, to go back to Jesus and ask Jesus, how is he building the church? And he is building the church so that the church can become what in the society. And I think this must be a conversation that is going on every time. Every generation must have this conversation. Otherwise, if we don't have this conversation in every generation, we are not able to hand over proper tradition, proper theology into the next generation. And so we need to arise in our day and begin to ask questions of what and questions of why, so that we may once again rediscover the purpose, the original intent of God when he is coming about with the question of the church. Otherwise, the worldly alternatives, which are already there, here in Africa and here in Kenya, I think what we are facing at the moment is a church that has completely bought the ideology of success and prosperity, and it's not success and prosperity defined by Jesus, but success and prosperity defined by the world. And so we have borrowed that idea from the world, and in fact we have twisted scripture to such an extent that when we read the word prosperity, when we read the word success, when we read the word blessing, which is a very common word in the Bible, we import the meaning of those words from the world into the Bible. In other words, there's something we call exegesis. We import the meaning of those words from the world, from what those words mean in the world, and we bring them into the New Testament and we read them in. And so the word prosperity in the New Testament, the word blessing in the New Testament means something totally different from what it means, in fact, in our English dictionaries. And so this is something that we need to think about quite critically, that we should not be employing what the world is telling us about church and about the Bible into the church, but we need to hear what the New Testament says, what the New Testament teaches about church, about our purpose here on earth, and then from there mold and pattern our lives after what the New Testament teaches, not what the world teaches. And I think the church in Kenya and the church in Africa generally has found itself in this kind of slavery, that we are not reading the New Testament for what the New Testament is or for what it teaches, but we are reading into the New Testament ideas that are very foreign into the Word of God, ideas and concepts and ideologies that are new to what the New Testament teaches. And so as a church, many times we find ourselves captives of the very systems that we decry against. And so this conversation is important. Missional Ekklesiology is a conversation that we are putting on the table, from where we can begin to talk about purpose, the purpose of church, why God intended it, why God, through his Son, Jesus Christ, founded it, realigning our lives and our minds with the original intent, reimagining once again the place of the church in the society. reconfiguring our lives after the very pattern of Jesus Christ. Because as we will continue to see from the New Testament in the future sessions, we will find that in fact Jesus Christ himself is the pattern, is the model from where the church must learn from. And so we are called disciples of Jesus because we are supposed to pattern our lives after the life of Jesus Christ himself. We will realize that, we will discover that as we continue to converse and to dialogue about missional ecclesiology. We will realize that Jesus Christ, he is the pattern, he is the model. When we look at him, we see what we should become. And in essence, in fact, before we even rediscover ecclesiology, true Ekklesia, we first of all need to rediscover Jesus, who is the true Ekklesia himself. He is the Ekklesia himself. Ekklesia, ultimately where we look and see, where we look and live. And so even before we rediscover church, we need to rediscover Jesus. We need to go back to the Gospels and once again read the Gospels without bringing in ideas from our world into the Gospel, but read out from the Gospel so that we may begin to see this man once again. Maybe compare him with the Jesus we have now. Maybe compare him with the Jesus we have been taught for many years and see whether he perfectly fits the picture we have of Jesus Christ at the moment. And so this journey is not just a journey of rediscovering church. It's a journey, in fact, of rediscovering Jesus himself, Christ, the Lord, the Father, the founder of the church. Hebrews describes Jesus as the founder, the Father, the originator. In fact, let's just quickly read that. It is Hebrews 11, in Hebrews 12 there. It comes about after the chapter on the great heroes of faith. It says there, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. Okay, it says there, since we there is a reference to God's people, to God's community. Let us there is a reference to the same people. Let us again run us there. It's this community, it's this Jesus movement. Let us with perseverance run the race that is set before us. Who is us there? And verse 2 says, looking to Jesus, looking. So that word looking there is staring. It's beholding. It's constantly looking at him. He is the one in front of us. He is the image. He is right there in front of us, and we are looking to him. And why are we looking at Jesus? We are looking at Jesus because he is the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. So for us to rediscover ourselves as the community of God's people, for the church to really know itself and its purpose on earth today, it must once again stare, look, and behold Jesus. And when they are beholding, and when we behold Jesus, we are beholding the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. And so, Missional Ekklesiology is a journey, it's a conversation, it's a dialogue. And what are we dialoguing about? We are dialoguing about Ekklesiology, Ekklesia, the church that Jesus Christ is building. But for us to have a genuine dialogue, a genuine conversation, we must first of all rediscover the founder of the church. We need to rediscover the founder of the church. We need to rediscover Jesus. We need to know Jesus. And when I say that, I don't mean knowing the Jesus of faith alone, but I mean knowing the Jesus of history. Because the Jesus of history must be the Jesus of faith. Okay, what do I mean by that? The Jesus whom we have come to believe, or the Jesus we have been taught about, the Jesus we have come to trust, our Savior, our Lord, our Redeemer, the one who takes care of us, the shepherd of our souls. That Jesus cannot be different from the Jesus who lived in this earth, first century world, around about 33 years. He lived, he died, and he was raised again. The image we have of Jesus, the Jesus of faith and the Jesus of history, must be one. It must be one image. It must be the same Jesus. The one who walked, ate, drank, visited, healed, taught, rebuked, crushed with the Pharisees, the religious systems of the day, fought, was hungry, and so he needed food. They rebuked Peter and walked with John and talked to his mother and the 12 disciples. That Jesus, that first century man, must be the same as the Jesus whom we have come to believe in the 21st century. He cannot be different. And so for us to know him, we cannot know him by having a spiritual experience. We cannot know him by, climbing a mountain and spending some 40 days there praying and fasting. We cannot know him by spending time in retreat centers in prayer. In fact, we don't know Jesus really through prayer. Prayer is a consequence of knowing Jesus. We know him by studying him, by looking at him, by staring at him in the pages of the New Testament, and in fact in the pages of the whole Bible. And so missional Christology, or missional ecclesiology, is a conversation, and that conversation must include a conversation about Jesus, because Jesus is the founder of the church. He is the one who tells us why the church. In fact, he is the one who tells us what the church is. Because in our day and age, we have so many organizations called church. But when you look at them and you compare what you see and what is in the New Testament, you can confidently say that they are not churches. They are groups, they are organizations, some of them business clubs, others kiosks, others, good, business groups, chama tu kama, the chamas we have all over the place. Why? Because when you compare them with what Jesus says about his church, they don't fit that category. And that's why this conversation is important. That's why this conversation is important. It's a conversation that will take us back to the Bible. It's a conversation that takes us back to the pages of the New Testament, so that we may read and study them once again in their context, without embroidering, without importing meaning from our systems into the New Testament. And so, friends, I want to welcome you into this conversation. This was just an introduction to this conversation. We will talk a lot about many other things from the Bible, from the New Testament. This was just an introduction. And so I want to welcome you to join me in this conversation every Wednesday night, 7 p.m. We will be live on Facebook at GospelLife, GospelLife Thick Facebook. We will be live there every Wednesday, 7 p.m. And I want to facilitate this conversation. I want to facilitate this dialogue. And so I welcome you. You can make comments right there as this program is continuing. Please, you should feel free to make comments. Let us talk. Let us converse. Let us engage the Bible. Let us engage the New Testament. Let us also engage our culture, our contemporary culture. Let us ask questions about whether what we have as church is the real deal, is a real thing as we find in the New Testament. So these sessions will be sessions of about 45 to 1 hour, and questions will be raised. Answers hopefully will be provided from the New Testament, from the Old Testament. Ideas will be questioned. New ideas will be brought forward. And as we continue, we will begin to realize that the church has a mission. That mission will become clearer and clearer. And a challenge will be placed before you to go and think about the church. Maybe you pastor, the church that you lead, the church whereby you are an elder, the church where you sing, the church where you are a member, and think and ask questions whether that church fits the same image, the image we find in the New Testament. So please join me as we begin this dialogue, this conversation, and let's see how this goes. Let's see whether we can return to the New Testament, rediscover Jesus, rediscover Ekklesia, rediscover, practices of the church that we have since lost, rediscover doctrine. What does Jesus really teach about church? What do the apostles? What did the apostles teach about the church? And that way begin to reconfigure our lives with the true image, the image of Jesus Christ. So for now, keep thinking about what I have already said. We will see you next week, and we will build from what we have said today. Thank you for listening to me, and God bless you. Amen.